Welcome to Conversations in the Void. I'm your host, Joshua Von Ammon, and joining me today is Alexander Dijulio. Alexander received his bachelor's degree at MICA in Baltimore. He's worked in cities of Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York. He's currently residing in Dallas. He's a co-founder of the Socialized Contemporary Artists Bureau, or also known as S.C.A.B. He's also the co-founder of That Gallery and Studio, which is his own residence and is still doing shows. It's an absolute pleasure here having him on the show today. Thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks, Josh.
So we can talk about recent stuff. Just had your second solo show at Circuit 12 Contemporary.
Yep.
Titled Constellation Logic.
Yeah.
You want to talk about it? You want me to talk about it?
I guess I could talk a little bit about what the name is as a start. Can't see it right now, but Constellation Logic, something I've been working on for a little while. It started with the idea of satellite sculptures, which are little sculptures that are in the proximity of another sculpture, separate objects, but could be constituted as one piece of art. So, or like a bunch of pieces to the whole, you could think of it as too. So constellations, they're stars separated, but they are organized into patterns like that we can recognize. And then they're then classified as like one thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know the names of individual stars, but I know the names of constellations. So that's sort of where the logic comes in to some of these sculptures, disparate pieces that come together to be one thing.
And I mean, the materials that went into the show, I guess we should talk a little bit about. I mean, I enjoyed helping you put them together.
Yeah,
there was hickory facades. Cedar. Every time I think it's hickory.
That's fine.
Anyway, it really divided up the space. It was really interesting how you sort of forced the viewer to you're working with a rectangle, for the space, but in particular, and you sort of really redirected the viewer, forced them through this sort of. It was a construction, 12-foot facade with this, sort
ramp.
of deck ramp.
Mm-hmm.
You go up and down and moving throughout the space, and a lot of the materials that you're working with, something I've always sort of also found a certain appeal for, to some varying degree, but predominantly with your appropriation of gold, but with emergency blankets and tar, like roofing tar, but working with oil. You've been working with these materials for quite a while, and it has a predominant focus in your work.
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about your attraction to those, or your history with them.
When we were talking earlier, the word that came out, and I liked it, is mimetic materials, things that have a similarity. They mime another art material, but predominantly I work with construction grade materials, or what typically would not be found in an art store. So not oil paints, not clay of late. Just a lot more alternative materials that can be used because they have similar characteristics or qualities to
same bases. Oil.
Right. Yeah. Tar, this tar that I'm working with, is very similar to oil paint because it's basically like a pigment suspended in oil with a solvent in it, and that dries out in the same way that oil paint does. Mm-hmm. And the gold is really important to me because it's got this just appeal to it, this lustrous light that it gives off that makes us attracted to it. But, the emergency blanket is a very cheap metallic material where the gold is, much rarer and sought after more. Mm-hmm. But I like the connection between the two, that there's both still have this, conversation of opulence and just desire and longing.
Mm-hmm. And, my kind of reaction to with at least these two sort of objects, they're symbolic sort of wealth in so many ways. Oil and gold, they just, contemporarily speaking, and then traditionally,
Sure.
Have always had this sort of necessity within culture. So, at least that was sort of my impression of it.
Absolutely. There's a lot of artists that have done work with gold before, Rauschenberg and James Lee Byers, people like that. And it's just, there's something very captivating about the material, and I'm seeing what I can push further on that, what there is still to be explored.
Mm-hmm. And so you've got a lot of exciting things coming up, or at least for the immediate future this summer. I know you have a couple projects.
Yeah. The one thing that is coming up soonest is a trip out to Iowa City to the Museum of the University of Iowa, where my friend is working now, and we're going to be putting together some lithographs. I did a lot of screen printing at college and earlier, but I've never done any litho work. So I'm going to be learning some of that and using some of the sculptural processes that I've been using, mainly with tar, to create some works on paper, which I haven't done in a couple of years. So the thing that really started this conversation is the fact that I've been using this asphalt tar, and then my friend Sarika is very invested into litho. That's sort of her major. She just got her master's degree from Iowa, and the process of producing a lithograph involves asphaltum. So I like that it could be the sourcing material for the imagery, and then also like be used in the process for creating the final product. There's like a nice duality there that is interesting to me, to both of us. So that's gonna.
And you get to play with new things.
And I get to play with new things, learn a new process. That's always
exciting.
awesome. Yeah.
And then after that,
I have one other show. There might be a couple of other things this summer, but the one thing I know of is a show out in Long Island, a group show that is the second year I've participated in it. And I like traveling a lot. Sam, who I work with at that, we both like
Samantha
traveling
McCurdy.
a lot. Samantha McCurdy. We both
Right.
like traveling to different cities and doing shows a lot, because there's a very interesting thing I think about being a sculpture artist, where like space and spaces, places really affect the way that you make work. So traveling to somewhere to do a show very much informs that work, or the way in which you approach making the work.
and we had a conversation earlier because I was sort of fishing out for what you're reading, but you like kind of talking like, well, I'm not really reading anything strictly focused on art necessarily, but a lot of it is sort of the discussion of the modes of experience that you can have.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just what would that be, like a sort of focus on phenomenological sort of
Definitely on
experiences?
phenomena and on space. So that's, both. I think phenomena plays between psychological space and physical space.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very interested in
Would
that.
you have a couple like books that you think are like real paramount, or something that's really interested you could throw out like as a reading?
Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, and On Longing by Susan Stewart is another one. They
What was
both
that
have
one
the-
by Kandinsky you mentioned?
Oh, On the Spiritual and Art. But that's
Not
definitely
necessarily the
it's
same
very much
subject.
about phenomena.
I mean-
absolutely. That's what I wrote my thesis from Micah on, was spirituality and artwork. So that text informed a lot, or I referenced that a lot in my thesis.
I mean, I've always really identified with your work in some respects, because I've always felt like a sort of invested sort of meditation into the material itself.
Mm-hmm.
I really get sort of involved when I sort of experience a material for what it is, rather than focusing too strongly on how to manipulate it,
Right.
allowing it to have its sort of its own voice. And, it really just becomes about like what the material does in and of its own intrinsic qualities, than how you can change it or how you can like edit it
Sure.
strongly.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of freedom involved, especially with like your real gravitic based sort of work, if gravitic is the real word. But
like
it's
it.
like you
It's pretty good
you
too.
have this material that sort of through gravity drapes around like a protruding object, holding it up with this like industrial plastic, and then in a moment it just goes off and it becomes a solid sculpture. It's a
Right.
stasis of movement.
I like that moment between the liquid and the solid, where there's that huge tension and that stress and that feeling of, could this material that I'm casting into the plastic or whatever it is, could it snap and everything just go like the dam breaks?
Which
Which it has happened a number of times, and I'm, crying and scrubbing the floor of the studio with a toothbrush because there's plaster all over the place. But there's that moment of stress and anxiety that I have where it's still in flux, and then like in a 1 second it solidifies, and that tension, becomes negated. It's like becomes a passive action after that, thing sort of sets.
we could talk about this for hours.
We could, yeah.
But we're running out of time. It's
Okay.
an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Yeah, same, man.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Ching ching. And thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you next week.
That's it.